If the only good bug is a dead bug, then Starship Troopers, the 2005 first-person shooter adaptation of Paul Verhoeven's film adaptation of Robert Heinlein's book, is a game that lets you make an awful lot of bugs very, very good. But the usually immensely fun act of murdering inferior life forms feels exceptionally bland in Starship Troopers, and what scant fun there is to be had does little to mitigate the numerous flaws and archaic design that make Starship Troopers an especially sloppy game. Starship Troopers falls into that particular FPS subgenre pioneered by, and indeed still championed by, Doom way back in 1993. It's a genre that has you killing things, but not the one or two enemies at a time that you see in most other games. I'm sure we can all agree that's for girls. You'll fight against swarms of enemies that number in the dozens or perhaps even hundreds. In fact, several of the 12 levels will see you at some point being so overrun that you have to retreat several times before finally being evacuated, just in time. So as you may imagine, it's a game where you do a lot of killing. And given that, it's remarkable just how bland the act of killing is in Starship Troopers. The weapons are immensely unsatisfying to use, looking and sounding rather pathetic, but worse, the game provides virtually no stimuli when killing stuff, so much so that the act of killing an enemy will barely even register with you. Forgive me if this seems a little sociopathic, but when playing a first-person shooter, I need to feel that I'm hurting my enemies, and then that I'm killing them, for it to be a satisfying kill. And Starship Troopers completely lacks this. It's a little easier to illustrate with an example, so here's a clip from Doom. And here's Starship Troopers. The difference may not actually be all that apparent when simply watching the footage, but the two games feel very different to play. When you shoot an enemy in Doom, you're given immensely satisfying cues. Visually, the enemy takes hits in a way that makes every shot feel good, and there are meaty sound effects to go with it. When it dies, the death animation is fantastic, and the sound effects are amazing. Every single kill is satisfying. In Starship Troopers, these enemies don't seem to react to the hits, and when they die, they simply fall over in unsatisfying ways with a pathetic, tinny squeal. I'm sure the argument could be made that the bugs don't feel pain or don't register it in a way that we recognise or whatever, but regardless of the motivation behind the decision, the combat has no weight to it, and it makes it incredibly bland. The closest thing there is to a satisfying stimulus is the ridiculous number of corpses littering the battleground after a minute or two of sustained combat, but that's about as satisfying as looking at someone else's cum stains. And it goes beyond simple stimuli. The enemies themselves are kind of rubbish. The early enemies are cool, those taken from, or only slightly adapted from, those seen in the film. The generic bug, the tiger, who is a tougher version of the generic bug, and then some green variant that spits some kind of acid at you. They're all fine. The flying bug seen in the film, and its fire-spewing brothers, are also fine. In fact, animations and sound effects notwithstanding, these early enemies are pretty great. Whoever designed the bugs for the film is a pretty fucking awesome guy. But whoever designed the new bugs for this game is a total jerk. There are three in particular that stand out as completely ridiculous. The first is a little fly. Imagine the flea men in Castlevania, then give them a devastating attack. Then also imagine that the fly has a face that looks kind of like a human's face. That's the Starship Troopers fly. Stupid looking and incredibly annoying to fight. The second enemy is a sniper bug. I kind of like the idea of a bug that's a sniper, and being a big fan of nature documentaries, I've seen plenty of insects with adaptations that seem no less ridiculous. But the problem is that they're really hard to see, and most of the time you're forced to let it pop off a few rounds at you before you can see it. Add to this the fact that they come in groups, and killing them is a very laborious process. Finally, there's a variant of the generic bug that seems to shoot rockets at you, complete with smoke trail. I don't even know what to say about that. And although some of the bosses are legitimately spectacular, others are utterly tedious. One particular mini-boss has you forcing it to expose its vulnerable nethers with which it fires projectiles, by hiding, only to pop out and shoot it. This in itself is a fairly annoying formula, but you also have to endure unlimited respawns of the generic warrior bugs during the encounter. In another boss sequence, you're locked in an arena with an enemy, and the techie is only able to figure out how to open the door after you kill it. Starship Troopers is already a game with weak fundamentals, but throw in some tedious enemies and archaic, cliched design, and you have the very definition of an awful game. The game also has absolutely no story. Now, most games have bad stories, FPS games in particular, so it usually seems a little futile to single out any one game for having a bad story, when virtually all of them are guilty of the same crime. But Starship Troopers isn't getting a free pass, because there's no story whatsoever. There isn't even a vague narrative, it's just one mission after another. If it wasn't for the difficulty curve, they could be played in absolutely any order. Considering the film's satirical heart and the book's political soul, there was an awful lot of potential to actually make an engaging story. Sadly, the closest you'll come to a story is clips from the film used largely out of context for no reason other than because they can. One of the better things in the game is how the levels are structured. Every level will give you a number of objectives to accomplish. You may start by locating a power box and switching on the power, then tracking down an engineer and escorting him around as he fixes things, all the while fighting off swarms of bugs, then perhaps getting into an AA battery and taking down some flying bugs to let a transport arrive, and then maybe taking down a boss or something before being ferried out as the bugs overrun the base. Every level has you doing a number of things, often backtracking across a fairly small area, and it definitely makes the game far more interesting than an A to B corridor shooter. But even the good parts of Starship Troopers are riddled with flaws. For instance, the characters you'll have to escort have no actual AI, they run on a fixed script, and these guys will follow it even if it means charging headfirst into a swarm of enemies, which is invariably what happens. Granted, they have quite a lot of health, but there's no joy in protecting someone who has no sense of self-preservation, or even rudimentary intelligence. The entire game is filled with problems like this that consistently undermine what little good there is in the game. It's also a monstrously ugly game. People who watch my reviews regularly will know that I very rarely criticise visuals, but Starship Troopers is hideous, and you can maybe argue that they needed to tone back on the visuals to get the unit numbers in there, and that may be slightly true. But games like Creative Assembly's Rome Total War, which came out months earlier, proved that this isn't the case. The animations are awful, the textures are absurdly bad, and a lot of the faces don't even look the right shape. But the worst thing of all is that the only way the dreadful engine could deal with so many models is to draw the distant ones as two-dimensional sprites. This would be kind of okay because it's largely unnoticeable, except for the fact that they'll often be right on top of you and they'll still be sprites, then they'll suddenly pop into 3D. As spectacular as it can be to see these huge swarms, it really is a monstrously ugly game. Although I've already touched on sound effects a few times, I think special mention is needed of the dialogue and voice acting. It's some of the worst I've ever heard in a game. Up there with the legendarily bad, like Gothic 3 and the original Resident Evil. Most of the voices also feel like extreme caricatures, and it's hard to take the game seriously.
We lost the Marauder's trace inside this old recycling facility. You may need to get close to him in order to pick up his signal.
I've flown into worse places. A few of the instruments are flipping, just like the Badlands all over again.
Yeah, well I'm flipping too. This is a dangerous area, so I'd get airborne as soon as you can.
Will do.
There are so few games in the Slaughter the Swarm FPS subgenre that it doesn't even have its own name, and although almost every new entrant into this subgenre seems to be kind of bad, Starship Troopers is unquestionably the worst of them.